Question for you. How often do you roll a die to move the 30 feet that your character is allowed in combat during their turn? How often do you roll a die to spot things that are around a corner? How often do you roll a die to see things that are right in front of your character's field of vision that they're looking right at? A doorway, the room in front of them, the floor. How often do you roll the dice to hit the broadside of a barn with your sword? How often does the game master call on you to roll the dice when you try and do so when you're out of the reach of that weapon? These are basic assumptions about where a character is in the world, what they can and can't do based on geography. And in a recent Matt Colville video, he took a really roundabout way to tell us all about how these same concepts can apply to character knowledge, to knowledge skills. And it really struck me as an odd perspective, a very long-winded way at arriving at a basic thing about role-playing games, which is that you don't need to roll for everything. And in fact, what you're doing in the fiction of the world is largely based upon intent, upon the player stating what they want their character to do, and that the dice are really something that intervene when we need to test something that's uncertain. I think that basically everyone can agree on that idea. You don't need to roll to hit the broadside of a barn. So why is it that there's this problem that Matt Colville is speaking to about how everyone dog piles in on a skill check when the cleric can't recall an obscure liturgical ritual? Why is it that the barbarian says, well,
Maybe I came upon this in my travels in the frozen north. I'd like to roll too.
and the game master says, sure, knock yourself out, man. And thus proceeds a gallery of different people picking up their d20 and shrugging their shoulders as each of them do or do not meet the DC. Well, I don't know why this is something of a news flash for the world, because if you look in the D&D 5th edition rulebook, and I don't just mean an obscure part of the Dungeon Master's Guide, I do mean inside of this tome, the Player's Handbook, we look at something which really speaks to the truth about why dice are rolled, what an ability check is. It may be easy to forget that skill rolls are a kind of ability check in D&D 5e. And what's more, even ability checks are within the chapter called Using Ability Scores, which is to say, when you want to use your character's intellect to recall a detail, when you want to use your character's wisdom to try and stay awake and keep yourself from getting your mind befuddled from lack of sleep or shadows dancing in the dark, and try and tell the difference between a lurking goblin and your imagination, it's your wisdom that's being invoked. And you really know it because someone told you yesterday, or you wrote it on a piece of paper, or you're walking around a building that really isn't maze-like, and you just need to remember your way out of the building. Well, we all remember when our shift is at work, or at least most of us do, most of the time. And we don't need to really test ourselves to do that. It's only in these uncertain moments that you pick up the dice and test something. Can you hit a monster which is being evasive in combat? Of course, you roll a die for that. It's called an attack roll. Do you evade a fireball that's coming at you with an immense amount of destructive potential and screaming at you at the speed of sound? Well, roll a dex save. Test your character's dexterity.
Test your might.
So why is it that we're in this situation, and this has happened before in the role-playing hobby, especially when it comes to something called spot checks, that we have gotten ourselves into the predicament of rolling dice for things that are often already factually established? What gives, man? For me, this goes back almost 10 years ago to the old school primer, Matt Finch's seminal work, which set off a lot of the old school Renaissance, where he critiqued in some fashion the practice of rolling to check for traps and rolling to spot things in the room and so on. And the habitual kind of preemptive throwing of the dice before narrating what a character did. And when it comes to perception, well, this is a whole other video that I'd love to get into about how we don't necessarily need to roll the dice every time we look around the room. Why do we need to roll the dice for a spot check sometimes? Well, I think it comes down to a test of vigilance. It can come down to a test of certainty. I'm sure there's no goblins lurking in that corner over there. We're safe to go ahead. Or I'm going to stay awake and I'm going to keep watch. I'm going to bring up the rear for our party. And I know that there are tentacles of shadow creeping up behind us, and I need to be the one that raises the alarm. Will I be able to keep my imagination in check? I will test my wisdom. When it comes down to these things, we're often testing the character's ability when there's an absence of fiction or fact. This is one of the things that struck me a little while ago, to start back on the beginning of this video, but how someone was critiquing how there was no way of knowing whether you were attacking the side shields of a starfighter or the front shields of a starfighter or the rear shields of a starfighter in Fantasy Flight Star Wars, because it's a narrative combat system and there's no such thing as a combat grid. How do I know which shields I'm shooting at? Well, it's a matter of the truth. Are you flying at the guy? Is he flying away from you? Is it a chase? These are questions which are easily answered just in the fiction. Now, when you get into a deep, layered combat, a hairball dogfight where there's many, many twisting entities that are writhing about, kind of like the beginning of Revenge of the Sith, then perhaps you might have reason to sketch out some of that on a combat board. Would that really be Star Wars, to step outside of that free flowing and freewheeling world where what happens is often a matter of what's pulpy? Well, that's another question for another day, but suffice it to say, the answer to which shields are you shooting at, we can figure out the answer based on what's happening in the world. I'd like to round out this video by sharing two pieces of advice that I read in some game manuals, which are a little bit off the beaten path, but I think have really served me very well and set me down this path where I've been really puzzled by how long it took for Matt Colville to suggest to all of us that sometimes you can't roll, and sometimes you don't need to roll. Sometimes only some characters can roll. And sometimes nobody can do it because they just aren't next to the barn. The first one is roll once and let it ride. It's a little piece of advice. Yeah, it's somewhat snarky in the first edition of Burning Wheel, at least. And essentially, Luke is speaking of the idea that he's seen a lot of times that people, when they're climbing a mountain, the GM will tell them to climb the mountain. And then 30 feet later, tell them to roll again to climb the mountain and climb the mountain over and over and over again. And the character is never really successful in their test of strength or endurance until they've rolled a ton of times and tempted fate. Is this really a way of testing if the character has the endurance and the strength and the skill to climb the mountain? Or is it really just a test of randomness? Is it a test of the dice? Are we overriding the karma, the investment that the character and the player have made in being good at this by telling them to roll a lot of times? Another example that Luke gives is the classic stealth situation where you're approaching a bandit camp and you need to roll to go from one bush to the next and one bush to the next and to cross the slippery, splashy stream and so on. When is it that you have slept behind the bandit's defenses? When is it that it's a success? Your intent was to sneak. When can I realize that intent? That's really where a lot of the answers to these questions come down. Is I want to remember how the ritual of Dorn goes so that I can blank, 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 so that I can predict where they will conduct the profane sacrifice, so that I can anticipate how much longer we have to complete the rod of seven parts. And, where on the calendar of the stars will the enemy cult realize their intent? See, that's the thing, is that this cleric that's in this situation that Matt Colville was imagining, he's trying to do something. He wants to use his knowledge of rituals, his knowledge of theology for some purpose in the world. And the test is, can he achieve that purpose? Now, I'm not saying every game needs to work the same way that Burning Wheel does, where it's all about intent leading to a test. You can do things other ways, but I've learned a lot from Luke Crane. Some people like to complain about how bossy Luke Crane is in especially the first edition of Burning Wheel, and how critical he is of other ways of playing. I mean, it is a game manual and he's telling you how to play his game, so I've always given him the benefit of the doubt. The second thing that rattles around in my brain when it comes to these questions is Vincent Baker's advice in Apocalypse World. Now, it's not even really advice, it's even a hard and fast rule, which is to say, to do the thing, do the thing. If you want your character to do a move in the Apocalypse World crunchy sense, then you are on deck as the player to narrate and tell us how that occurs. How does two advantage symbols on a Fantasy Flight Star Wars die roll translate into a boost die for your friend? What did you do in order for that to happen? That's a matter of narration. That's how Apocalypse World affected my gameplay in the last year, is that I would often harp on this to my players, and as a player, I would ask the question of, but how? Because it's really about the fiction. It's about what those symbols mean in the world. It's not just an empty mechanical procedure. It's a role-playing game and an imagined world that we share in together. So, to do the thing, it often comes down to doing the thing. Matt Finch was maybe a little grumpy about how that seemed to be slipping through the cracks in whatever game of 3rd edition D&D made him grumpy enough to write that in the first place. But I think a great many of us learned a lot of lessons from that seminal tract. And that's why Apocalypse World, I think, is often so successful, is it brings that idea home in a way that even the most interested in rules and mechanics personalities can understand and play along with. That same set of ideas is a lot of what I see in Star Trek Adventures, and what's made me so excited to play that game is that you narrate, you say what your character is doing, and at some point the GM says that will take a die roll. I think somewhere at Matt Colville's table, there's a world where they pick up a die before they say what they're going to do, or maybe without even doing anything. And then we start figuring out, what did that die roll mean after the fact? Now, sometimes that can be an interesting mechanic, but when it comes to characters' recollections, when it comes to something like testing a character's ability score, I'm not so sure it's as necessary, or really if that perspective is a well founded one that leads people to reach for the dice so readily. This idea that characters can do things, and sometimes they can just do them, is also an idea called karma, which I believe maybe Jonathan Tweet kind of invented when he wrote an essay about drama, fortune, and karma, probably about 20 years ago. The wheel is turning pretty fast here, folks, when it comes to RPG theory craft. And so I understand how some of these things can slip through the cracks. And that's why I feel a certain amount of gravity around the turning of the decade here, as it's 2020, to share some of this advice with you and share this perspective, which I think maybe beats around the bush a little bit less. If you enjoyed this video, if you enjoy this type of content, then I would encourage you to like and subscribe and share this video around. My name is Antoine, sometimes known as the French chemist or the complex games apologist. I wish you happy gaming and make it through this frigid winter so that we can soldier on into the sunshine.